Well, thank you all for coming along and joining us tonight. Before we get started, we'll just do a quick run through on some of the functionality of Zoom, just to ensure you have the best possible experience here with us tonight. So if you're having trouble with the audio, as we've got up on the screen there, you can adjust your speaker settings through the audio settings button on the bottom left of the window. Also check that your volume is on. If you have any trouble, don't forget that we're recording this webinar and a link to the recording will be sent to you directly next week and will be up on our site permanently. Also tonight, we'd love you to interact with us and chat amongst yourselves as well. We find sometimes the conversations that you are having all between one another are fascinating. Sometimes I get distracted by them, but I'll try my best not to tonight. So if you have any questions, please put them into the chat box. We've got Dr. Pauline Ho in the chat box here with us tonight. If you want to address just us, that's all panelists and attendees is everyone. Or if you have a colleague in here, you'll be able to just chat to them if you'd like to as well. So lots of different ways you can chat tonight. All right, so fantastic. So we're so delighted we had 450 people register for this webinar, which is just incredible. And that covered all the states and territories across Australia, all the sectors, and excitedly as well, internationally. So we had registrations from the US, China, Brazil, Chile, Spain, United Kingdom, Indonesia, India, Kenya, Malaysia, New Zealand, Philippines, and the Russian Federation, to name a few. There are more. So we would love you to let us know where you're joining us from here tonight. So pop it into the chat box and just say where you're coming in from and what your role is as well. So maybe teacher, Chile, or wherever you're coming from. Fantastic. Sydney down under, Melbourne, good to have you here. Oh, lovely, academic, fantastic. All right, I will stop being distracted by the chat box and we'll move on any second now. All right, so throughout this conversation tonight, we're going to be exploring evidence-informed ways that we can improve behaviour within a classroom. I myself have been a teacher, I'm still registered. We know that this is one of the key challenges I think we face as teachers and leaders. So we'll be answering, we got 34 different questions from you all tonight. We'll put those up into the panel into some groups of questions that I'll be asking my panel members tonight, and that is Bryan Field and Susanna Schofield are joining us tonight. And also as always, we'll send you resources that will answer those questions and have further readings for you under each of the topics that we'll be covering tonight. So great to have you here. Now, before we begin, I would really like to acknowledge that the three speakers on the panel tonight, and Pauline as well, we're all coming from Wurundjeri country on the Kulin Nation. And I would like to pay our respects to elders past, present, and most importantly, those that are emerging. And we extend our respects to the traditional owners on all the lands of which you are joining us from tonight. So what are we going to cover tonight in this webinar? So we're going to share a brief overview of the research and the evidence that exists in this space that will be led by Susanna. We're going to talk about how this has best been translated into recommendations at the school level. And we're going to have Bryan, who has so much, and I'm pretty excited to have Bryan here with us here because he has so much particular expertise in this area, and that's incredibly difficult to find. So really excited to have Bryan here to share that expertise. So before we get going, I'm just going to give a brief bio to Susanna and Bryan's experience, just to let you know a little bit of where they're coming from tonight. So Bryan is the head of junior school at a school in southeast Melbourne region. So Bryan works with low socioeconomic area and has a passion for working with children that have been impacted by trauma. Bryan is currently leading the orderly environment changes at his school and is a key part of the Frankston North Education Plan. And he's also working alongside the differentiated support of school improvement team out of the Victorian Department of Education. Bryan collaborates regularly with Tom Brazil. He was saying yesterday weekly, so very regularly, I think we can say, to ensure that the school's practices support students who have been impacted by trauma. Prior to working in educational leadership, Bryan has worked in social care in a residential care for young people in his hometown of Cork in Ireland, which is fantastic. It's fun, exciting. Bryan has a bachelor degree in social science through the University College of Cork and a graduate diploma in education from La Trobe University here in Melbourne. All right, fantastic to have you here, Bryan, and really looking forward to your contributions here tonight.
Thanks, great to be here. Thanks.
Pleasure.
Tanya. Cheers.
Now, Susanna thankfully joined our team in May 2019, and her work has really been focused in on tailoring evidence assets to the Australian context. So she has been leading all the work around our guidance report. She's really been supporting educational jurisdictions to use evidence assets and working alongside educators to help good practice become common practice in Australian education. Most recently, Susanna has worked to convene and support networks. Prior to joining Social Ventures Australia, she practiced as a teacher. So Susanna has worked with young Australians across the spectrum from early learning to tertiary settings. She holds a Bachelor of Exercise Science from the Australian Catholic University, a Masters of Teaching and a Masters of Education Policy, specifically focused on international policy from the University of Melbourne, where she focused in on the selection and induction of teachers in a global context. So Susanna brings a range of experiences and also a lot of academic expertise with her tonight as well. So welcome, Susanna, fantastic to have you here. And I'll hand over to you at this point, but I'll pop back soon.
Thanks so much, Tanya. As Tanya mentioned, we're going to just do a short introduction before we really dive into our panel discussion. And I'm just going to start on the next slide with a little bit of a dive into our Teaching and Learning Toolkit. So you'll see this change over for you in a moment. We're talking really tonight about behaviour and behaviour interventions in schools. These are particularly behaviour interventions where we see a link to improving achievement for young people in our classrooms. So a decrease in negative behaviours such as aggression, violence, and bullying, correlating through to an improved academic outcome for students. And there's certainly outcomes outside of those academic outcomes as well. This summary from our toolkit, and I do invite you to dive into this in a bit more detail, looks at these behaviour interventions overall, and we talk a lot about averages when we're looking at the toolkit: moderate impact, moderate cost, based on extensive evidence. And so you'll see those represented here in our icons as well. A couple of points to note here before we jump into the next level of detail. There's a number of considerations that we explore, and again, these are listed when you dive into the detail in the toolkit. But we see some common themes emerge across these behaviour interventions where they are having a higher impact than others. We'll talk a little bit about these in the panel discussion tonight, but those are things like higher engagement of parents and communities often see better results in behavioural interventions, where interventions last longer than 2 months and hopefully up to sort of 6 months. And particularly something that we'll focus on this evening is the necessity of professional learning that supports this. But we wanted to show you on the next slide a little bit of detail around the variability of these studies. If you've been to one of our webinars before, you will see us often talk about the variability, just so that you can understand that when we talk about these averages of research, you do need to go down into the next step often to find out if there's particular instances where we're seeing particularly strong impact, or if there are instances where we're seeing negative or zero impact. And there's a few outliers here. So READY, for example, 2009 study was quite a large study, a number of sort of systematic response. So we were looking at a number of studies within that, a really large number of students, about 1,400. And it really focused in on students with emotional disturbances, so students who are already at risk rather than the general classroom population. On the other end, GAMCEL, for example, this was looking particularly at anger in students. And so we won't go into great detail about that one, but interestingly, apart from these sort of outliers that we see, the variation in behaviour interventions is not nearly as large as what we experience in a number of other areas. So there are a few approaches in the toolkit that relate to this. Social emotional learning is one, teaching assistance is another, and that's got extreme variation that sits underneath it. So this is just an invitation to think about your context and how the research fits and matches to your scenario. So it might be worth, as you're thinking about your own practice, diving into a few of these, and we've summarised the abstracts on the website as well to really see how applicable this is for you. The next page, great, thanks Tanya, is a summary of some of the tools that we have at Evidence for Learning, and also with our partner, the Education Endowment Foundation in the UK, and you'll see the Improving Behaviour in Schools guidance report listed there, which is one that we have not yet translated for an Australian audience, but is of interest to us, and which is why we're doing this webinar tonight. So I've talked a little bit about the toolkit as well. Tanya is here for follow-up questions. She leads our work in the toolkit. And also underneath that, you'll see an Australasian research summary. This looks primarily at what's coming out of Australia and New Zealand so that we can get a little bit more relevant to how closely does this context align to ours. And what we find there is a lot of the studies that are sitting in the Australasian research summary look at anti-bullying type measures. And we anecdotally know that there's a number of them happening in our schools in Australia. So we really invite you to jump in to those resources as well. We're going to look at a really high level summary of the recommendations that sit underneath the Improving Behaviour in Schools report next as well. And so these are those recommendations. There's 6 recommendations across the behaviour guidance report, and they're really broken down here into sort of how we would look at our energy in terms of where we are proactive. And so you'll see that there's four particular recommendations that are proactive strategies. Reactive strategies, which really look at those students who might slip through the cracks and being responsive to them through interventions and individual approaches. And then the very last one is all about implementation. So do we have a really clear whole school way that we can do this, that we know that we're preparing for, so that we have a sustainable program or approach at the end of the day? We're going to come back to a few of these as we jump into the panel. So I'm going to hand back to Tanya now to kick off our discussion tonight.
Right, thanks so much, Susanna. It's always lovely to start with some evidence at the front end. especially the toolkit, which I know that's my baby, so I'm a bit biased towards it, but I love the guidance reports as well. So fantastic. I've introduced our speakers. So we're going to dive straight into the questions that you have given us, and they'll be answering those. And we'll move to the point where that it's just our faces on the screen now, so you can have a bit more of a close-up view of us, and keep typing into that chat box. All right, so Bryan, you're the head of junior school, so you look after years 7, 8 and 9 and are really focused in a new role, which is that of wellbeing and engagement. So we'd call this, sort of across Australia, we'd call this a lead teacher role.
Yeah.
Which sounds very exciting. Wellbeing and engagement is such a crucial area. You've held various different leadership positions at Monterey Secondary College before this as well for the past 4 years, and that your demographic there at Monterey Secondary College, 65% of that comes from students that we say are in the lowest quarter of socioeconomic disadvantage.
Yeah.
So, or SES, more commonly known.
SES,
more common terminology across Australia and all internationally as well. So how are you leading the orderly learning environment changes at your school? And what early indicators of success have you seen so far, Bryan?
Well, we've actually had a big overhaul of the early learning environment at the school. And everything we do is linked to the Berry Street education model, like you mentioned earlier with Dr. Tom Runzell. So we meet weekly with him to talk about the early learning environment. The first thing that I brought in this year was each student in the school having a ready to learn plan. So what that looks like is each student chooses 3 proactive strategies that they can use within the classroom to regulate themselves, whether that's going for a drink of water, whatever that is, so that they choose it themselves, and it's unpacked with the teacher then as you need to. Also, we noticed that a lot of kids are leaving the class because of issues. So what we did was, instead of sending a student that will be regulated to find a coordinator or find someone, that we have like a texting system through the laptops that staff have, so they can contact the on-call person, and then that person comes down and talks to the student. Do they need to be removed? Do they need to go into circuit break or to have a little break, depending on what the student needs? Also, which was quite controversial to start, getting rid of the detentions in the school. So there's no more detention. There's no more detentions in the school. What we have instead is restorative practice. So instead of a student going on a detention which most kids weren't turning up anyway. So like if they had a detention with a teacher that they didn't even know why they were there, and it was with a random teacher throughout the school, instead we have that restorative where the student isn't able to go back to that class until they have that restorative with that teacher and myself or someone else on leadership. So that's had a big impact for the kids. Also, we have like a behaviour continuum where it's on every board in the school. So remind, refocus, relocate, and remove. So the students know that that's the process of the continuum, that if they're on remind, they need to probably have a think about using their ready to learn plan. If they're on refocus, they really need to probably use their ready to learn plan. They are prompted by the teacher. Also, we brought in seating plans across the whole school. So every class has a seating plan, and that's developed by the teachers with kind of my support, obviously, to go into the classes and make sure the kids are in it, which links to all that predictability stuff that we do with Berry Street. So it's really important. Also, we've got a class this year as well, which is really good in year 7, 8 and in 9 next year as well. It's called All About Me. So it's just all about social emotional learning. So self-regulation, self-awareness, self-care. So the whole class is like that, which half the class is led by the students as well. So they get to choose at the start and at the end how it's run a bit. So it's really good for student voice. I suppose the main impacts that I've seen, because I've been here, this is my 7th year now. So the biggest impact that I've seen is less students out of class for random reasons, that there's an actual reason why they're out of class. They know why they're out of class with the ready to learn plans. Also, with the preliminary data from the attitude to school survey, that's been well up as well. So that's really good, really positive for the students. And response from the staff has been really positive towards, because it's quick and meaningful responses to the behavior rather than an attention that it doesn't even know why they're there type of thing. So I think they've been the main impacts for us, I think.
Yeah, that's incredibly exciting.
Yeah, no, it's really good.
I really like there was just a question there. So the question was, what was the name of the plan that each child has? So it's a ready to learn plan. And within that, the child has, or the student has specified 3 different self-regulatory strategies that they've developed up with their teacher that will work specifically for them.
And parents have access to it as well. So the parents can see it as well.
Fantastic.
So, and it's the type of language you use with a student, you know, during that restorative conversation, you'll be saying, oh, did you use your ready to learn plan? Then they might say, oh, I don't know what that is. Well, let's make one, because they would have one, but they might forget it. So it's that repetition of, you know, the language around the ready to learn and all that.
And I'm sure parents would have appreciated that.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. Because
as a parent myself, I would appreciate that.
Yeah, and I think because like the parents are really involved in what we do at the school anyway, whether it's the meetings or the ILPs, because we're bringing in all ILPs for all kids next year. But I think, yeah, it's really important that the parents are involved as well, like Susanna was touching on earlier.
Definitely. And we've just had another question as well, which was the data source. So that was the attitude to school survey, which is part of the department's response to monitoring its student self-report on attitudes to school. It's quite it's lovely.
Yeah, it's really thorough.
It's a lovely survey.
Yeah,
I mean, I love a survey. It's a beautiful survey. Thank you, Bryan. That was wonderful. Now, Susanna, you taught in primary and secondary, which is really useful for us tonight, because I know that we have some primary teachers on the line. In the areas of physical education and health predominantly, and also you were a Year 9 pastoral leader. So the hat that you wear tonight really draws on that experience. And I guess my first question to you is thinking about the knowledge base that you now have and you presented to us earlier, how much of that do you wish you'd had in the classroom to begin with?
It's a good question, and I think the answer is all of it would have been helpful, particularly as an early career teacher. And I think one of the things about leaving the classroom is that you look back and think, oh, the knowledge that I've gained since then, particularly when you stay in the education field, would have made me a better teacher at the time. And I can definitely look back and think, oh, I would do that differently. Had my time again. But I think particularly when we're talking about behaviour and these areas, as a young female teacher, as a graduate early career teacher, there's a privilege in having a link with, particularly with girls, and having that basis to start to form really strong relationships. Having said that, I don't think I always had the tools to capitalise on those relationships and to know where to go, even when students were coming to me and reaching out to me for these particular things. So certainly there's a lot that would come into it. I think particularly from the guidance report, the approach of the whole school in this together is something that really resonates with me. And I think for early career teachers, but also teachers throughout their careers, that sense of being in it together and having consistent views, things like Bryan spoke about, a common language, a really consistent approach would have been incredibly helpful at the time.
And just thinking back as well, for probably our education careers, we would have loved that in our schools as well. So it's wonderful to know that that's occurring now. So Bryan, and we've spoken about this just before as well, you've been heavily influenced and are employing the Berry Street model there in collaboration with Dr. Tom Brazil. How can you describe how that's guided your approach as a school and a leader? And what other resources have you drawn on really to build your resource? And the job of a leader is never done, is what we're saying there.
Definitely, that was just the cleaning lady came in there to say hello. That's right.
Tonight.
Yeah, she sees me here this time. Yeah, so like Dr. Brunzell has really influenced a lot of the work that we're doing at the school. So the weekly meetings is, like you said, it's a lot, but it's really valued space that we have. It's really, really good. So that's kind of all staff have been trained with the Berry Street education model. So we're halfway through that at the moment. I'd recommend anyone in any other school to do that if they could. 100%, and just focusing on those stress responses that the students have and getting those kids to be self-aware of their own behavior, and then just the language that the staff are using. So that's kind of impacting all our work at the moment. Also, we're bringing in as well learning walks and coaching for those staff that would need it, whether it's around instruction model or curriculum or behavior. So obviously the behavior space would be the area that I'd be one of the leaders in, myself and the AP for that. So I think that'll be really good. I'd say other approaches that I've kind of used kind of outside of the box would be the stuff that I did, you mentioned earlier, residential care. So I worked in residential care for young people coming out of juvenile detention. So within that space, you have to do a lot of training around therapeutic crisis intervention, which would be training that like people in psych wards would use and stuff like that to kind of de-escalate people when they're escalating. So to see that curve and when it's going to happen, which links in as well with the Berry Street educational stuff. So that would be stuff when it's really tier 3 behavior that's really they're really at that stressful end of the curve. So so bringing all that stuff, and then just the preconditions to learning as well, and knowing what they are and how important it is, which also links to the guidance report as well, the recommendations from that. So I think having a few different things, and
I love the whole school approach that you have there, and really that focus in on how you're deprivatising the practice through the learning walks and encouraging improved teacher practice through coaching, which we know to be probably one of the most robust things that can actually work in implementation. Is just fantastic to hear. So you're really drawing on a broad evidence base, but then really quite specific around the language use, so that everyone's reading from the same choir sheet, so to speak, which is fantastic.
Yeah, and I think I forgot to mention as well, we have like weekly PDs as well with the whole staff. We just had one tonight, which is led by different staff within those areas. So it was really good that it's not just the leadership running it. There was like the assistant sub-school leaders were running it tonight. So that was really good. So it's getting different perspectives and how that they focus on the behavior continuum and their reaction to specific behaviors by the student. Is really good to get that kind of coherent and collaborative practice across the school. And then I think that's really good for being that consistency for the students as well. It's really good.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So a weekly PD, and who's invited along to that? Is that all
everyone? Yeah, like there was I think half the education support staff were there tonight as well. So it's open to everyone. So it depends if they opt in or not. So it's definitely, and it's recorded as well. So it was recorded tonight in WebEx. So it's really good.
Fantastic. And Susanna, more broadly, what do we know about some best bets in improving behaviour within the classroom?
There's a number of things, and I think I briefly touched on them, but to go over them really explicitly, there's a few things from the research that we see as common features where there's high impact. So where students have been identified as at risk, interventions for those students and having those interventions in place early so that they're reactive, but we have prepared and planned for them before they're needed. Things that are externally evaluated, so programs, particularly where schools are selecting from programs that they don't design themselves, is incredibly important. There are a lot of programs, off-the-shelf programs out there. And we would say to schools, if there isn't a strong independent evaluation, that in any case, and this is true as well if you're designing your own program, you need to monitor and evaluate that plan, that program, to make sure it's having the intended impact for you. And there's features such as the length of time, so something that runs consistently across 6 months or a year is far more effective than a one-off behaviour skills type day that schools would run. And as Bryan mentioned, having parents and community involved, so actually buying in, having that reinforcement at home through the language and the learning is incredibly important. The last thing there that Bryan mentioned as well is sort of the professional development, that the professional development is both upfront and then ongoing. So we see that through coaching, through follow-up professional learning opportunities, through mentoring, and that it's offered to not just teachers and teaching staff, but to student support officers, teaching assistants, people who deal with students coming into a front office, everyone across the school. So front gate to back gate type of learning for staff at your school, and they're really crucial factors. But the key is to monitor and evaluate how that's happening in your school, so that you can adapt it appropriately.
Yeah, so it's really, I think you make a really important point there about making sure that there's upfront and then follow on, because we know that changing habits, which is what we're trying to do here, is incredibly difficult for adults. It is achievable. We know we can rewire our neurons, but it'll take us about 2 months to do that. And so we know that we need to be upfront taught, beliefs to be challenged in a thoughtful and reflective manner. And then if we have coaching, which is when we're on the ground practicing and we're receiving real-time feedback, that's when we can make real changes and improve the behaviour of our students through changing our own actions. And that's the real hard part of leadership, I see. And the exciting part too. It's exciting for me because I love implementation science. So I think you love the change. You would love watching the change too, wouldn't you, Bryan?
Oh, definitely, 100%, especially being here, this is the 7th year now, so you can really see it from the origin of how it changed and stuff. So it's been really good.
Beautiful. Beautiful. So we touched on this, that your teaching assistants are involved in and the professional learning is offered to them. So how specifically do you deploy teaching assistants at Monterey Secondary College in respects to trying to improve students' behaviour?
So the education support staff, they've done the training as well with Berry Street, so they will be informed with that. One of the things that in one of my previous leadership roles was working with the integration staff within the classroom, and one of the things that we started doing from last year was, instead of just working with, say, the funded kid and sitting next to just a funded kid, that the staff members for everybody, because we know that there can be a stigma attached to say someone being completely on top of someone during a classroom environment, rather than one student, it's all the kids in the room, so it kind of takes that stigma away. Also, they can come to obviously to the PL like you mentioned every week, and being a part of those meetings with the individual learning plans and developing those behavior management plans and reminding the students of them that they're involved with, and obviously they've access to the ready to learn plans as well. So I think just being involved in everything that the teaching staff is doing, I think it's really important, that it's not just it's up to the teacher. Like obviously it's the discipline within the classroom is going to be more towards the teacher, but the education support staff can definitely support that within the classroom. I think they need to be an integral part to it as well.
And it's great to see that the model, and you've tried the new model of the integration of the teaching assistant into the whole classroom. How long has that been going for?
I'd say about 1.5 years. Like time now seems a bit crazy with COVID, but I'd say
I know.
Yeah, it's been probably since term 2 last year. So getting that, like just reinforcing that, like you said, it takes a bit of time to change practice. But I think just getting that, like that you're not just with that PSD student, that you're with everybody in the room. And I think the kids really kind of take a breath and go, oh, they're actually not just for me, they're for everybody. And I think within those meetings, like when I was the PSD coordinator, that was stuff I would say constantly in the meetings, that they're not just there for you, they're there for everybody, and just keep repeating that. And I think that the students would get it after a while, then it's not just for me. So yeah. Fantastic. And that helps the relationship as well, I think. they're more inclined to, you know, seek help if they know that they're not getting bombarded by someone, I think.
True. And if that, because we know as well, sometimes diagnoses are very borderline. So that means that the help is available for all students within the classroom, which I think is a crucial aspect too. And with the communication between the teaching assistants and the teachers, how do you facilitate that? And you mentioned that through the 2 different layers of plans that you have within your school. So having that there, and then is there a lot of open conversation, do you find, between the teachers and the teaching assistants? I know that high schools, my recollection is being incredibly busy all of the time. How does that happen?
I know that, like, in the past, not so much this year because of COVID, but there would be, say, we'd have like a wraparound meeting with, say, if there's a student, getting everyone's intake. It wouldn't necessarily be someone that's funded. It could be anyone that's involved. So
Fantastic.
if you, like, as in opening up to the whole staff, as in, if you know any information about the student that you think is important, whether they're funded or not, whether ES or not, it doesn't matter. Just to share your experience and to kind of so to kind of make that, like, the free flowing of information to best help the student. I think that's really important for us.
Yeah, and it would be that's the best way to support the student, because I think different teachers will have different pieces of information.
Yeah,
because we all interact with our students in different ways. And I guess this question now is to Susanna. So what does the evidence base around the effective use of teaching assistants tell us in regards to behaviour?
We've got some really interesting, I suppose, anecdotal work around teaching assistants at the moment, which I think is relevant. But on the whole, there is a really strong outcome for teaching assistants when they're used really well. And I say used in the most respectful way, because we're talking about leaders having the most control over how effective a teaching assistant can be. How leaders choose to deploy, and Bryan's spoken about this, teaching assistants in the classroom is incredibly important, because with all the best intentions, a really wonderful teaching assistant, if they're not given the right support, might not have the impact that they could. So certainly there's a few things that come out of our teaching assistants work that we know about, and we do have a guidance report and some work in the toolkit that will support this too. Is that where teaching assistants are integrated into the classroom, so they're actually working alongside the teacher, either rotating roles, so moving around the classroom and working with smaller groups, that can be really impactful. And primarily that's because it frees the teacher up to spend more time with those students who might need more support. And the teacher is the person in that room that is the most highly trained for that scenario. So often where we see negative impact of teaching assistants, it's because that teaching assistant is, like Bryan spoke about, attached to just one student and not the whole class. There's a few implications of that. Certainly there's some funding things, and schools need to be really thoughtful about how they have those conversations with students and parents, because certainly there is a stigma around secondary school in particular around having that attached support. And we've worked with a number of schools, one school who was on a webinar recently with us, who actually found that as soon as they flipped that switch, the students were much more likely to engage with the teaching assistant. And I think that, Bryan, is what you were talking about then as well. So there's a number of things there, but again, really important that teaching assistants and other classroom support officers are part of the process, that they get the training, that they're part of those conversations, that they're sharing the same language, because they've got an incredible amount to contribute back with knowledge of the students as well.
They do. And as you said before, when we're talking about this, we hold it in the highest respect, probably me the most, because I'm married to one. So I hold, like, teaching assistants very high, and I think they can be crucial. And I know they're called various different names in every state and territory, so it's more integration aid or all different names across Australia. But yeah, really excellent point. Sorry, I got distracted by my own personal anecdote there. But they can play such an important role, and the conversations, I guess, that I have with my husband daily about the learning that the students can achieve with their help, and in the correct deployment and in constant conversation with the teachers, that's a sizable workforce that everyone could really use for the betterment of not just behaviour, but improved learning as well. So that's my little plug for teaching assistants there. Great. Okay, so Bryan, what behavioural intervention approaches do you take with supporting students with additional needs, and also those that have come from backgrounds of trauma? Would you be able to explain a bit more about the approach of your school?
Yeah, within the school, we have a very high number of kids that have been impacted by trauma. Very significant, much higher than I'd say than the 65% that are in the low socioeconomic area. It'd be more close to 75-80% would have some type of trauma background. So within the, like I mentioned earlier, they have students of ILPs, behaviour management plan. Next year, we're moving into all students within the school to have an individual learning plan, which will be great, because it'll give that free flowing of information to all students, whether they need it or not. For example, like the ready to learn plans, all the kids have them, but only maybe 20% use them within a class, so they don't all use them, but at least it's all available to everybody, which is great. So it's not necessarily behaviour intervention we have a really comprehensive intervention reading program in the school, and we know that low literacy links to can lead to behaviour issues within the classroom, especially in high school, because the gap just gets further and further as it moves on. So we got a really comprehensive intervention program as well in the school, linked to the DSSI, which you mentioned earlier, the differentiated team that help us as well, which is really good. We also have this thing that came in this year with a re-engagement program. So for students that really struggle to engage in classroom, now that would be more of a behaviour model rather than, say, not turning up to school, which we obviously engagement as well, but it's on an attendance side. This is more behaviour. So the students would go into the re-engagement program, and they'd have a blended timetable. So it could be 2 hours of a project that they enjoy, and then go back into class, or during the classes that they struggle, they would have, say, some other intervention instead of that class, and then building their social and emotional abilities to then go back into that class, and then and to be followed by someone as well. So we have youth workers as well in the school that would follow a student into the class and kind of take notes on how they're going with behavior, and their self-regulation is the big one for us at the moment. So like being able to regulate, and then if they're using the ready to learn plan. We also have a mentor program as well within the school. So this came out of COVID as well, which was really good, that every student in the school had a mentor during COVID, but what it's trickled down to kids that we feel need it, especially the year 7s came back last week. So I just made a list of the kids that I felt, he'll probably need a mentor, she'll probably need a mentor, and that list is getting smaller by the day now, because they don't really need it, but it was good just to have that initial check-in, have that kind of relationship building as well. I think that's it as well. I think like everything we do is trauma informed practice, because it's all linked to the Berry Street model anyway. So I think everything that we do is linked to it, So I think it's kind of there's a whole school level, there's a kind of cohort level, and there's an individual level. So we're really flexible for where that student would fit in. But there's definitely something for everyone.
Yeah, that sounds amazing, especially I think the depth of individualisation, which is only going to grow as of next year once all the individualised learning plans are completed. That's really exciting space to be in, and just the flexibility that's afforded the students as well. And the mentor, I could see, especially this year in Melbourne, where we've experienced such a prolonged lockdown time, and our students in home supported learning, how beneficial that would be.
Yeah,
definitely. And Susanna, are there any resources or key takeaways to support students with additional needs that we can turn to, and those that have experienced trauma?
There's certainly plenty, and one of the things that we'll do is send around after this webinar a bit of a running list of resources that schools, both primary and secondary, can draw on. There's some specific differences there between the two. I think more broadly, the sort of advice or the health warning around it is that if it ties back to that first recommendation, which is really about knowing your students, and we know this as well through the ASIL teaching standards, there's a reason why it's the very first one. To know your students is incredibly important, and to have people that know your students across the school is incredibly important. Bryan mentioned Berry Street. That's a really strong example of one service that's out there and offered. There's other ways that schools can do this, and with varying degrees, because there's some complexity here in working with therapeutic services, psychologists and psychiatrists, some of which are built within schools and some of which are not. And so the more linkages you can create with those types of services and providers, the better equipped the wraparound service is to support those students who have additional needs or trauma backgrounds. So we'll make sure everyone gets a copy of those types of resources as a follow-up for the webinar too.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really, and Bryan was mentioning that as well, is the incorporation of all staff, and then additional external people that can assist really when circumstances require it in your tier 3s interventions, which is really useful. So Bryan, like many other schools across Australia, Monterey Secondary College had a substantial amount of term 1. Well, it was from March. I remember it quite well because I've been in home supported learning. So it was from March through to just last week. You were saying the students were coming back. I know that during some of that time, some students were on site, the year 11 and 12s during that time. The year 7s have just come back on. So, and you'll be bringing the 8s, 9s and 10s next week.
Yeah, back Monday.
So it's been an incredible year to be a teacher and a leader. So what type of procedures have you used? And you started to talk about the mentoring there. Like, how did you implement that? What did that look like on the ground for your students, and who was involved in supporting your students in that time? And specifically, how can you encourage good behaviour when you're virtual?
Yeah, it's a good question now. Like, it was running smoothly now, but at the start I remember we had all these troubleshooting questions and how are we going to impact the learning and all this type of stuff. So I think the first thing that we had to do is trying to make it as similar to school as possible, even though it's online. So we'd still have the first slide of every teacher's thing was supposed to be, or whatever they're putting online would be the values of the college and the expectations, and then the protocols for those students to use while they're online. So whether that's in a classroom, put your microphone off or whatever that protocol was. So that worked really well. And also we brought in, I would do fortnightly assemblies to kind of just say hello to the kids and kind of get them just a bit of normalcy. We also had check-in survey every day. So the student would check in and would give us a quick indication of how they were going. So we'd have a few staff on that who would contact the student directly, and then and contact a mentor as well. So with the mentors, they'd call them 3 times a week. So it started off as 3 calls a week, and then it would depend on the student, depending on the needs, it would go down. But a high, like I mentioned earlier, a high number of our students are trauma impacted, so there was a lot of work around the mentorship, and then it's been great because that mentorship now is leading into on-site. So it's kind of organically grown from being online to being on site, which usually is the other way around. But it's been really good. So when we say to the kids that language of, oh, you have a mentor, they're not going to go, what the hell is that? They're going to know straight away that that's someone that's going to be connected to me. So I think that's going to be really useful for us. Also, something that I think that came out of the RFL was the transition, how important that is. I think going from primary to secondary, getting all that information, and going from the junior college into the senior college, that's something that the information we had to get out to the parents, to the staff, and kind of make sure that everyone was on board and people knew what they were doing before they come back. And I think just sending information constantly to parents, like all the parents would have my number, so I get random texts, God knows what time, but it's really good because they're engaged in it, and I know if I'm getting a text or a call off a parent at a weekend, that I know they're engaged. So like with the 8s and 9s and 10s coming back, there'll be a lot of stuff put on social media and on Compass, and I'll send out text individually to parents as well. So I think just a kind of wraparound approach, I think, like you mentioned earlier, is really important during the RFL.
And I think that especially the mentors making that much contact must have been extremely useful, just to help students stay engaged in that really difficult time.
Yeah, and they would get rewards as well. I mentioned they would get rewards for just answering the phone. So they would just be like, I could call a student and they would just say, they might groan on the phone, but at least they've answered and I know it's them. Are you okay? Yes, I'm okay. Okay, thank you for answering, because obviously the well-being was the most important thing during this time, and not letting them completely disengage from school was paramount.
Definitely, and incredibly hard to regulate when you're not in the room.
Yeah, 100%.
So fantastic that you found ways to do that. And I think you were saying too that the engagement levels were still quite high with your online learning you found through that system.
Like maybe the amount of work had gone down, but kids checking in, so there was, every kid was doing something. Do you know what I mean? Which was great. That there might have been say kids that were just doing the SEL survey, but that was okay because they're telling us how they're feeling, and we're like, okay, at least we know that they're okay. So I think that was really good for us.
Yeah, definitely. And every parent supporting the child too would have different capabilities and resources to draw from. So 100%. I think it was such a varied experience for every child across Australia and the world. So that's all you can deal with. So we're going to move to the final question for the panel. And so, Bryan, I know this is hard to distill, but what do you think is the most important aspect for improving behaviour at Monterey Secondary College when thinking about the impact that you can have on your students?
I would say it'd be kind of a 4-pronged approach, really. The first thing being consistency to the approach, like whatever approach you're doing, that all staff are across from it, with the language, with the behaviour management within the classroom, whatever continuum you're using. I think predictability is a massive one for me as well, especially with the training I had in the past, that the kids know how you're going to react in a certain situation. Because if you're really heightened, they're going to be really heightened and deregulated. So if they know that your consequences or rewards are predictable, it's really good for them, especially with the trauma. And around the instruction model as well, and bringing all that into the practice. I think being really flexible as well, that not every one shoe definitely doesn't fit all. So every kid is impacted by trauma differently, depending on a myriad of reasons. But I think just being really flexible with the students, because it's okay to have a modified, blended timetable, whatever you're doing, just to fit the student needs, I think is really important. And the last thing I think Susanna touched on earlier is just knowing the students and building those relationships, and not necessarily knowing what footy team they go for, but knowing how they learn and how they react to certain situations. That like if you know that a student has got a trauma, family violence background, you're not going to stand over them when you're talking, the tone of voice, this type of stuff, rather than their personal likes and dislikes. I think that knowing how they learn is massively important.
And it really, we know that student to teacher relationship has an effect size of 0.75.
Yeah, it's massive.
Yeah, it's massive, because that's the type of information that can lead to a child learning or not.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
So it's really leveraging that and sharing that across the community of the school.
Yeah,
is crucial. And what about you, Susanna? What do you think is a key take-home message from the evidence base within the toolkit and the guidance report on this area?
I think really the key point here that I would leave people with is around implementation. Just being so deliberate about the decisions that you make as a school, as a whole staff, so that you can do all those things that Bryan was talking about and be consistent, have those positive relationships and set up, but really thinking incredibly diligently about how you do that, because you can't do everything at once. And that's a recipe for disaster in a lot of cases, particularly where we see change fatigue occurring in schools because there is so much going on. This year is a perfect example of a perfect storm. So just to be mindful about what are the steps that you're going to take as a school, as leaders within schools, to support everyone through the process, so that you've got a really consistent approach to behaviour. And that's no matter if you're in a primary or secondary setting, if you're in early childhood as well. And that planning allows you to take into consideration things like, well, can we sustain this? Is this something that our school can do for a long time, or reliant on funding that's going to run out in 2 or 3 years? So that implementation message is where I would like to leave people today. I think it's incredibly important.
Well, it is. It's everything really, isn't it? It's every decision that's made at a school. So I can't thank you both enough for your generous contributions tonight, especially you, Bryan, just bringing all your expertise and everything that you've been leaving at Monterey, and your deep knowledge and passion for your students, which is evident. So thank you so much
for
being
pleasure.
Part of our
Thanks a lot.
Panel tonight. Now I'm just going to jump back to the slides, and we have another webinar, and I think I know we keep saying it's our last webinar and then another one comes. So another one has come up because we've had a really overwhelmingly positive response to our systematic review on wellbeing that was produced by ACR, led by Dr. Pauline Ho, managed the process, and Dr. Catherine Dix's team at ACR wrote the report. It's really, I mean, it's very, very beautiful, especially if you love statistics, and then statistics in how they relate to having an impact on students' wellbeing and also academic growth. So it's the largest systematic study so far conducted, I think, in the world, we can say. So that's going to be really exciting. So we'll have Pauline, we'll have Catherine Dix, and we'll also have Michael Rosenbrook from Wodonga Secondary College talking to his practices in CEL around that. So you can register for that. And I've just heard today that we are going to have one more webinar for the rest of the year. So we'll let you know that that will be up on our site soon. I'll be coordinating that. And that will be from Danielle Toon, one of our other associate directors. So where to now? If you'd like to get in touch, please do with us. And if there's any questions as well, pass them on to us and we can get them to Bryan as well. We're on Twitter and Facebook. I'm on Twitter as well, so feel free to reach out there. We've got an e-newsletter, which I think is riveting, and comes out every month with lots of different evidence from around the world, and also keeps you up to date with what we're doing. You'll all receive automatically a certificate of attendance for coming along tonight. And we've also got our evidence-informed educator network. So really, we're going to wrap up there for tonight, and just like to again thank my panel, thank especially Bryan for joining us tonight from Monterey, and just really exciting to hear about that work that you're leading. And really, I guess I feel a lot of joy for your students, really knowing that they've got such a good chance of overcoming the barriers that we know that can be so difficult to overcome when you're coming from backgrounds surrounded by disadvantage, and especially if that has additional trauma involved as well. So yeah. Keep going on your path, Bryan.
Thanks very much.
And with your excellent team, I know other people from your team. So yeah, keep up the excellent work.
It's been really good. Yeah. Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. All right, everyone, we'll say good night for now. And thanks to everyone from joining us across the world. And we'll see you next time.